Hi. Talking about the legacy of Noah's sons, we're going to be looking at the black sheep of the family, Ham. Now, Ham's family did include more than just his son Canaan, the one that was specifically cursed by Noah. Ham's other sons, though, had their problems. And these descendants not only had problems, they caused problems for that son Shem, who we probably know as Israel. Well, we're going to start today in Genesis 6 and look through verses 6 through 21 as it talks about the sons of Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Put today is Libya. What happened to the sons of Put? We don't know. It's not listed, so we're not going to go there. Mizraim, that's the name for Egypt in Hebrew. And the land of Ham also refers in the Bible and Psalms and other places to include the land of Egypt. It said that Israel and Jacob went down to the land of Ham, and that's where they dwelt, in the land of Egypt. Well, in Genesis 10, verses 13, 14, it tells us about Mizraim's son, Caslium, and he was the father of the Philistines. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Old Testament and the problems that Israel had with their neighboring nations, you've probably heard of at least one of these 5 Philistine cities. There was Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, where Goliath came from, and Ekron. These cities and countries were always at war throughout the whole time with Israel. Think about Goliath, that giant. His family were continual enemies of Israel throughout the entire reign of King David. As a matter of fact, that's how David got to be king, at least in the beginning, when he fought and killed that giant Goliath. Well, the youngest son is Canaan, and he's the one that Noah said was going to be cursed. The family members settled in a region that was named Canaan. And so they became the Canaanites. And they occupied land in both Israel and modern Lebanon. Genesis 10, verses 15 through 17 tells us the name of some of these places. No, we're not having a geography lesson. I wasn't that great in geography anyway. But these names are really necessary for today's lesson, okay? Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. Then the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Gershonites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, and the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Wow, that's a whole lot of ites. The descendants of Sidon, who were Canaan's firstborn, these were not destroyed by Joshua when he took Israel in to conquer the promised land. But we read about them later on, even in the book of Judges, and it said that they lived in fortified cities. And later on, even after the reign of David, when his son Solomon becomes king, they're still around. Solomon's getting ready to build the temple, that great temple of God. And you would think, as careful as he was to make sure that everything was exactly right and pleasing to the Lord, that it would be like the tabernacle, that all of the people who worked on it would be good and would be godly people. Well, what did Solomon do? He contacts the king of Tyre and says, hey, I want some of the workers from Sidon, some of the Sidonians, to cut timber for the temple. By this time, they're no longer enemies of Israel, but they have been accepted. They've been friends. They're now useful. But they were only friends on the surface. And that's what happens when you don't get rid of the enemies like you're supposed to. They have a way of coming into your life and only becoming those surface friends. The Jebusites, Amorites, Gershonites, and Hivites, all those Canaanite countries were destroyed. All those people, they were removed when Israel went in to take over the promised land. But the Canaanites were not good people. They were evil, they were wicked, and they practiced what was probably the most sordid, evil, and vile religion of all. This religion was based upon murder, child sacrifice, sexual perversion. Their main idol was Baal. Now, Baal was the son of El, who was the head of a pantheon or immoral deities. Pantheon can mean a false god, or it can mean the temple of a false god. And we see throughout Israel that they were constantly worshiping Baal, the false gods, and many of the other gods of that time. And also, they were setting up temples and shrines where they could come and worship them. So from its very introduction to Israel, on their journey to the promised land, we see that Baal worship was never really removed. It became a constant thorn in the flesh for those Israelites, something that they were fighting, and eventually it even divided the kingdom. The Canaanite civilization was so corrupt that God had commanded the Israelites to completely obliterate them. But it didn't happen, and that's why the problems continued. The other sons of Canaan and of Ham and Japheth, they were evil too, and they were against God's people. But this judgment of abolishment was only placed on Canaan's family. Now let's look at Cush. Cush was the oldest son of Ham. And he had 5 sons that were named in the book in Genesis 10 through 7. But he had one son that was more famous than all. That was Nimrod. Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Verses 8 and 9 of chapter 10. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was like a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Cush's son Nimrod is described as the first mighty man on the earth. He is given that individual title. And this, though, is in direct contrast to the prophecy that Noah had made on that Ham's descendants would be servants to both Shem and to Japheth. Perhaps it was the resentment that Ham felt toward his father Noah that got passed down to Canaan's grandson. It seems like Nimrod's whole goal in life was to set out to disprove the prophecy of his grandpa. Well, so we have to remember, Nimrod's name actually means to rebel, or let us rebel. And that's exactly what he did. Nimrod was one who lived up to his name. His description as a mighty hunter before the Lord suggests the great arrogance that he must have had. Like Lamech, the son of Cain, way back in Genesis 4, he was well known and very prominent for everything that he did. You know, it's almost reminiscent of those wicked warriors before the flood in Genesis 6:4. It says that they grew up to be, they were mighty men, they were warriors. But perhaps Nimrod was the greatest one of all. Maybe he became a model. He looked back and saw what was and says, I'm going to set the standard for what's to come. The next 2 verses, 10 and 12, give us an idea of what happened and what he was capable of. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Achish, Akkad, and Calah in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ur, and Calah. Nimrod was the founder of the very first Mesopotamia kingdom. he both built and ruled Babylon. This was the first great city after the flood. People had lived in nations, they had lived in land, but this was the first time they came together in a city. And as the first world ruler, he then extended his kingdom on out to the land of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was built. And he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Nineveh, we heard about that with the prophet Jonah. So that's another town that stayed around, just like Babylon. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and we still hear about it today. Israel was continually under oppression from Nimrod's warlike nations. As a matter of fact, we talked about Assyria. Assyria was the one that came and took over and then later exiled the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, what about Babylon? Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. They burned it to the ground. Then, after that, they took the king and all the people living in Jerusalem and Judah captive and into exiles under King Nebuchadnezzar. See, although God did ordain government, it was to restrain evil, not so it could spread. But Nimrod destroyed and distorted that concept, and he established his own kingdom. This is the first time that the word kingdom appears in the Bible, and it suggests the beginning of those world systems characterized by idolatry and opposition to the Lord. Now, while it's the first time it's mentioned, way back in Genesis 10, it doesn't end. It doesn't end with Genesis. It doesn't end with the Old Testament. It doesn't even end as the people live through the New Testament. In the book of Revelation, we're still reading about it at the very end of the Bible. And we're reading specifically about Babylon, this kingdom that Nimrod set up. Babylon is talked about in Revelation 17, verses 3 through 6. And it's also talked about in chapter 18, but I just want to read these few verses. And John, the Revelator, the one who wrote the book of Revelation, he's having a vision. And it says, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her head a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." So here she is. This kingdom that Nimrod started in Genesis goes on. And we see here that it not only starts as a world power for the then known world, as small as it was, but it becomes a power today, a power against God and those who would serve him. From Genesis, Babylon's notorious beginning went on so that it became a wicked city, openly rebelling and fighting against God and his people. Babylon invented the first false religion, worshiping stars, or we know it, astrology. If you get the daily newspaper, whether online or in print, you can turn and flip over and get your report, because someone is going to give you what the zodiacs, what the signs have to say is they read your astrology report for the day. Call the 1-900 number. Daniel 2. This was quite a few years after Genesis. King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, but he just can't remember it. And so what's he do? Daniel 2:2. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. We see from this that the effects of Ham through Cush still make a greater impact on society today than those of the sons of Canaan. Well, this part ends with sort of like a little summary of the 4 sons. Genesis 10:20. These were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, and in their nations. We've looked at 2 of the sons, and as we've seen these beginning genealogies, we find a key that unlocks much of the Old Testament and paves the way for the New Testament. Nearly all the enemies of God are introduced in Genesis, and most of them in chapter 10. Knowing their origin helps us understand much of what's going to happen beyond Genesis. And it's going to help us to understand next week as we talk about the 3rd son of Noah, Shem, the one who became the leader and the ancestor of Abraham. As we are drawing this to a close, we've got 2 more sessions. We're going to talk about Shem. We're going to close it out with the Tower of Babel. Look to see what happened there and catch a glimpse of what's going on today because of Genesis.